Welcome to Saga Thursday, your weekly Saga source. I am Raj, your guide on this Saga journey. Today we're having a little chat with Stephen Holdeman III. This is a very interesting fellow, a Saga superfan, very active on the Saga Facebook groups and the Adepticon tournament scene, as we shall see. Stephen will be helping me with the Franks battle board review. But before we can do that, we need to get to know Stephen. And this week we got a very special guest, Stephen Holdeman III, according to your Facebook profile.
Yep, that's right.
Do you go by the third?
I do. I love to, honestly. It's a dying tradition. I love to go by the third.
Yeah, it sounds cool. It takes you back to the Saga age, just purely based off the name there. So
right.
That's awesome. So you are on here to talk about the Franks. This is one of the most requested battle boards after the Strathclyde Welsh is the first. We're saving that. It's going to be the last Dark Age one that we tackle.
We've got some insight in our group there too on that one.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe we'll be in contact.
Absolutely.
But we're going to tackle the Franks today, and I don't know if you remember, but we actually played at Adepticon 2 years ago, and that's how I remembered that you played the Franks. You're a very distinctive fellow there with your crew, so you're part of the guys that dress up in the somewhat period dress. So
right.
Yeah, what was the inspiration for that, for showing up like that?
Well, I got to say, the first time for the first Adepticon, first U.S. Open, we went to, I went there by myself, and I was excited to compete. And I saw John Stentz from Minnesota up there walk in at a certain point with his kilt on and all this stuff. And as you pointed out in an earlier thing, I'm in a band, and we're a Viking black metal band, so we have a whole bunch of garb and stuff. I had a bag with all that stuff in my car. I wasn't really planning on it, but I saw this guy walk in and all of his kind of Scottish pride, and I said, no. And so I ran back out and got my stuff and kind of jumped in. And it kind of grabbed onto a tradition, so each time we bring a guy up from the group, we try to get him to dress up to match some sort of part. And I think Saga's pretty light but competitive atmosphere, and so I think it certainly helps there too. It helps draw attention to a greatness.
Yeah, that's awesome. That it's just impromptu. You just had it in your car. You're like, fuck that.
It was kind of a challenge.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I just saw him there. Oh, I just couldn't do it. I had to get my stuff on. So I have a nice $500 wolf. I might as well put it on more occasions, just other than the party. So.
Exactly. So yeah, you ran the Franks 2 years ago, and I'm assuming you probably had a bunch of games running up to then. So you're pretty experienced as anybody is going to be on this battle board. So how did you do in the Grand Melee with the Franks? Maybe
let me tell you. Moving up into it, I played Saga since it came out, I think 2011, and I've played at least a game a week, usually more than that. I kind of dropped all other games. A lot of guys in my group kind of migrated to it, so it was the one for me. We admired the Franks board ever since it came around. Coming out of the first Grand Melee, I had pulled third or fourth or so. I wanted to get up there and really show myself off, and so I wanted to do it with gusto with the Franks. And I realized that in a kind of Elon way. They say Elon is like a type of arrogance that French knights have and stuff like that. So most appropriately, with a lot of Elon, I decided I wanted to take the Franks because on a international scene, I thought, the Franks winning a victory, the most complicated board in my opinion, and lots of others. It was a true show of prestige of your skill of play and stuff like that. So leading up, I practiced. I tried to get 2-3 games in a week minimum, and I also tried to get a ton of drills in. I think drills are an important part of Saga that we should think about. If we look over at chess players, for example, and they really want to up their game, they do a lot of advanced things outside of just playing the game itself to try to focus on different small aspects of their game, and they go ahead and move forward. And with the Franks especially, we'll get into reasons about this a little bit later. When we look at what the board has to offer, you must know the fundamentals of the game and have it drilled down so that you are conditioned to just happen every single time that you see it, because there's not a lot of room for error. You can think of the Franks as a very complex machine at a certain point, and it'll start to do well for you, or it'll start to balance out. But you lose focus for a second, it spins, or you get that bad dice roll, and suddenly the numbers go falling straight down, and you're obliterated. And so, going into the Adepticon, I was more confident with myself full of arrogance going into with any war game I had ever played in my life. I was there, and so well, dice are a pretty complicated thing. They don't always roll the way you want them to, and that was an incredible catastrophe on some dice rolls. It honestly shook me to my core. I'd rehearsed and practiced and fought with these guys for so long. I knew every base statistic. I knew how much I could possibly fail each time. And, you know, all war gamers build around that as a core, you know, all the time, and then add on their own taste or strategy. It didn't matter when you shoot at something 18 times trying to hit on threes and you hit them twice in vital moments and you say, okay. My last round of Adepticon, I played Monty, and he was covering his face. We talked a lot when we first met at Adepticon, and I've loved to have correspondence with him, just talking about different Saga aspects. And he was so embarrassed for me. At the same time, he kept saying, that's not right, and he would kind of shy over my dice, and he was incredibly kind about it. But sometimes there's just nothing you can do. That's still a part of the dice games. But we can say that leaving Adepticon, I focused on chess a lot. I focused a ton on chess because there's no dice rules in that. But going into the event, I was nearly undefeated with my Franks. I had no loss except for 1 out of 50, and then some draws mixed in there because I had practiced so much. My group is already pretty competitive, really focused on game first. And then
game a week,
backward.
pretty tight, I bet, with movement and everything else. So.
Absolutely. So we were trying to mix it up. I would ask people to play, you know, the things that upset you the most, and try to move from there. But that's really something that I feel like you have to do with the Franks. If you're going to want to take the Franks as an army, you need to be ready to try to prepare yourself for a lot of times. John Fry, who is Ducat on the Saga forums and stuff like that, Big Rules Answer and stuff, also says that he loves the Franks board, but he likes to affectionately call it the Headache Army, because you playing it get a tremendous headache a lot of times unless you are just prepared for it, pretty much. And your opponent at the same time starts to get a tremendous headache because you're talking so much at them. Things are moving around on the board. All sorts of things are happening. And they start to, at a certain point, almost just want to say, like, okay, whatever you say. But the Frank player, knowing how crazy a lot of the stuff that's happening is sometimes, want to be very clear to them about what and why is happening, because you don't want to say later that, you pulled one over on me just because you were talking too much or something. Pay attention, because this is quite a little magic trick we're going to pull on you here. So that's
it definitely got a taste of that in our game, where you explained everything that was happening, but there was a lot of dice being moved around on the board. You can activate different abilities or kind of change your tactics, or however that works. We'll get into it. But there was a lot of that going on. So I want to go back to the drills and exactly. So this is how I'm picturing it: is you roll 6 Saga dice, or just say, what happens if I get a rare, uncommon, and then the rest commons, and then maybe go through every iteration? Is that what it was? Or
that's one of the forms of the drill, but that is the way to drill your proficiency with the board itself in Saga, and a lot of us can just do that sitting and thinking about it with it up on our phones at work or something like that. That's an easy thing to ponder, but we have to switch over to the fact that you must be skilled at the war game aspect of Saga to be successful with the Franks. Measurement, distance, everything like that is vital to your success. In other armies, Vikings or something like that, Anglo-Danes, some of these robust guys, looking at the new boards and stuff like that, the picks or something, they don't necessarily need a vital deployment. If you mess them up, it's going to be okay. And one of the things in Saga is that, unlike other historical war games, when you get flanked or something else like that, it's not an implied negative right away. And if it's a catastrophe, there's a good chance you're going to come around. But with the Franks, you have pretty much no punching power except for precise focus a lot of the times. But I have to say that the way that I played the Franks and what I focused on is just one tiny facet of what the Franks can do, because they have the most diverse army list out of anything else. I won't stray from the drill topic too much right now. To go back to it, then, one of the ways we want to do is to set up a couple things. The first that I think all Saga players should try to think about is the terrain game. First of all, you have to understand that you have competitive terrain right away at Saga. You're not arriving at a set table. You're getting to decide and have an effect on the terrain that's happening every single time. So if you pick the same terrain pieces every time, and then you deploy them at the same time, and really you're picking 1 through 6, because you should be planning to move 6 pieces around. If you have picked 3 terrain pieces, your opponent has picked 3 terrain pieces. Maybe they win the roll and they pick first or something like that. No matter what, if you drill it over and over again, by the time you sit down, whether you're playing in Germany or California, you'll be sitting down at home turf every single time. You're going to know that you're going to be fighting on one of 20 or so battlefields that you've prepared for or set up or thought about. So without ever deploying your guys, a great practice thing to do is with every Saga army, every warband, every build that you create, think about the best scenario for their terrain and then practice it. You can sit down with a buddy and go back and forth and just deploy. We think about competitive deployment using things like large spaced hills to separate out rocky ground or building. That's a common one. Or trying to soak up areas so that your opponent cannot deploy terrain correctly and they must discard it at the end or something like that. But then there's just the idea of each scenario. And most of the time when I'm talking about all of this, we're presuming that we're just fighting in an individual, just straight up fight. Champions of God, or God will recognize his, I forget which it is, that is just the kill points fight. So through all my conversation, we're kind of be presuming that we're talking about that. And then from there, we adapt everything to the scenarios. Because a lot of times, if you're playing competitive Saga, or you just really like the game aspect, you're usually playing straight up fight most of the time, and then you prep some scenarios to lighten it up every once in a while. Or you have a tournament coming up, and the tournament knows it's not going to be fight each time or something like that.
Exactly.
So by having a good idea of your terrain, by being prepared for it every time, you know that in a time of stress, you might be able to fall back into a building that you know most likely is going to be there, or because you're fighting an offensive infantry army or something like that, you set up your crops or your woods in a way that either funnels them in or offers them no cover on the way in the case of playing an army of Franks that shoots. And in my opinion, I think Franks that shoots are the best Franks. But there's some other options like that, and we'll get onto that a little bit later. The next part, though, is just deployment itself. Deployment is incredibly important. In some other games, you might be able to deploy and win the game right away just from your deployment. And Saga isn't quite one of those games, but it does make you prepared. And for someone like the Franks, or almost all the other continental armies, that's going to be Normans or Byzantines, or the Romans really like this too at the same time, must depend on a tight deployment, not necessarily tight, but a thoughtful deployment. There should be no unit that you're placing down haphazardly. You should know every individual unit, what its duty is, how it's supposed to perform, and where it's to be performing the very best. And so those are common things that we all realize when we try to deploy, but a lot of times we don't think about it until the second we're trying to put it down on the table. And that's a huge problem. That's, again, something the Franks can pull themselves out of. The Franks can pull themselves out of almost any situation as long as you're tooled up for it, but at the same time, you must be prepared for it. And so the combination of those two drills are vital with all armies, but I feel with the Franks and some of the other kind of lightweight or continental armies that are relying on attrition through rounds rather than one maximizing round for themselves each time, then you have to practice some of the fundamentals. So
yeah, those are some great points, especially with the terrain. Some tournaments will do it differently, but for the most part, you're going to be able to choose your pieces of terrain. So it's really interesting. You mentioned a building to fall back to. It's really, like, you could always have a building, as long as the terrain's available. Like, you can always pick that. It could be moved or potentially eliminated if they roll a 6 or whatever. But that's something in Saga that really isn't reflected in other games, is the ability to control your terrain. So you could always have a woods in the middle if you wanted that, and you could play every single game for the most part with a woods in the middle, and then you know how to play that, and what you usually do. And then with your deployment and stuff, that's something too that's interesting. You'll always be able to control your deployment for the most part. There's a couple scenarios where you change the order, but the actual placement of the guys will be the same. Yeah, I think especially for that Battle of the Ford, you might really sit down and think how you're going to do this. depending on what you see
I
on the
found
other
going
side.
into Adepticon with that being one of the main missions, that's one that you definitely have to practice your scenario, because you do have a little bit of options, and it still is a straight fight, but that's another one where you have the option to put a couple buildings down, put some other things around. And it's also wise to try to understand when you really want to be bidding under on your terrain to try to get an increased chance of removing a specific piece of their terrain, because then you get +1 on your roll and stuff. So to ignore the Saga's great gift, which is the gift of terrain and stuff like that, the ease and great way that you can use it, it is a mistake at the very beginning of Saga. And so with Franks, you must be aware of it. But now with that concept, you'll think about all your other armies and say, what is my perfect terrain? If I was to pick my battlefield every single time, what does it look like? To go back to the deployment aspect, the other thing is to mechanically do it yourself. So at your home, at your game store, whichever, set up your guys in deployment. You can have your friend across the table counter-deploying against you, and that can be really helpful too. But just practicing that over and over and over again is one of the important things with them. Measuring precisely where each unit is going to be, knowing that whether you want them to still be in range of 4 inches to receive fatigue after a charge and accept it because you have this, and this lined up appropriately for it, or instead everyone is spaced more than 4 inches but within 6 inches so that they can still charge or try to do some other mechanic like that too, because you want to have the entire army flexible in a lot of ways.
Well, that's it for this week. Stephen will be back next week discussing the Franks. I'm going to see you guys then.
Saga!